Are you trying to figure out what to do as society seems to be getting more and more angry around you and arguing and having so much conflict? You just don't even want to step outside your door. Well, I've got the perfect guest for you today, right here at the lifestyle.org podcast. Today, I have with me doctors Nolan Higdon and Mickey Huff. Just had you guys on the Lifestyle TV show. 22 and a half minutes went way too fast. So I said, I've got to have these guys here. Welcome to you, Mickey and Nolan.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Roy. Always a pleasure here.
You bet. You guys knocked it out of the park. And the biggest bummer for me is we film, I filmed 20 episodes that week. And then it takes a couple of months before the episode comes out. And the moment I talked to you guys, I said, these guys have the answers for the challenge, societal challenge that we're in today. My other, and I knew that your episodes, it's going to be a couple of months before it comes out and it drops on broadcast TV. And we're hoping to get this season on Amazon Prime Video as well. So nice. It's going to be a couple of months. And you guys had so much great content. I wanted to get it out a little bit sooner, but also go into depth. So thanks for being with me today.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
So you guys are professors. You teach our incredible university students, and you teach media literacy. You teach history. Those things probably are the best combination to go together with what you do. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing as America seems to be more and more agitated and in conflict?
I think one of the things we're noticing as professors, as the outside world becomes more polarized, so do our students. And so there's a lot of expectations in the classroom that, the instructor is going to preach to the choir, if you will. But we know effective teaching, necessitates sharing views we like and dislike and getting students to wrestle with them. And so I think getting students comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable is one of the challenges I would say that we face every term.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Roy, I teach at a large community college in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have a really diverse body of students. Really across the spectrum, from ideologically, race, perspective. There's so many different definitions to diversity, right? We have to remember that diversity is very diverse and intersectionality should be very intersectional. I kid you not. But I think that the challenge is how do we meet all the students where they are in this so-called post-pandemic world? And what can we do to encourage them to think critically and independently, but also acknowledge that many people are going through really hard times. And our political culture is in extraordinary disarray. It's been just addled with more than historically usual contention, extraordinary hyperpartisanship. More and more people rely on their opinions and their belief systems and ignore factual reality. And this is something that happens again across the political spectrum. We have a fragmented media landscape that really also, unfortunately, promotes that kind of division because it's really profitable for a for-profit media system. And the agitation that's caused spills over into the student population. And what Nolan and I try to do is make the classroom a laboratory sort of to effectively model how do we deal with each other? How do we agree to disagree, as it were, is the title of our textbook. And there's a lot of rich material in it that hopefully provides opportunities for students to really explore their full potential and not just come out sort of parroting or just regurgitating what they think their instructor wants to hear.
I can't tell you how excited I was when I first heard what you guys are trying to do, because it seems like within academia, that's such an area of destruction, tearing down what students believe, but not really building a better system. But you guys have actually written a textbook, like you said, Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy. You've got a couple of other books, The Media and Me, a guide to critical media literacy for young people, The Anatomy of Fake News, which came out in 2020. You guys are way ahead of your time because it came out in 2020. Anatomy of Fake News, a critical news education, and The Podcaster's Dilemma, Decolonizing Podcasters in the Era of Surveillance Capitalism. So we're going to dig into those books a little bit more. But I want to ask you, are you finding any like pushback from other professors? Are you finding yourself at odds with them? You're trying to solve conflict. Is this causing you conflict?
Yeah, I'd say most certainly. We get pushback. The typical things that we hear are, I shouldn't have to talk to the other side, or it's not my job to correct people when they're frustrated with someone's worldview.
Yeah.
But one of the things we do consistently in our writing, and I think this is really important, is we remind people that we live in a democracy. And so if you want to change this country in any direction, no matter what that change may be, you have to build a coalition, and that necessitates changing minds, which means that necessitates work. And if you're not willing to put the work in, like I always tell people, you're in luck. Like authoritarian regimes are always looking for people who don't want to do work to live under their rule. But in a democracy, it's up to all of us to work 24 hours a day to reach out, change minds, to understand, to learn. That just comes the responsibility of being a citizen in a democracy.
Yeah, it seems extra difficult today, though. Yeah, you had mentioned, Mickey, about the media, and it's a for-profit institution. I used to remember every couple of years is when I would avoid TV. Because it was election time, and you knew they were going to have these ads of, did you know this guy wants criminals to live next door to you and child molesters to play in your backyard, and it'd be all this stuff that you knew you had to sift through, because there was some subtle nuance there that they're taking something out of context and trying to make the other candidate look really bad, so that you, of course, would vote for them because you're not voting for the bad guy. But now it's no longer just every couple of years during the campaign commercials. Now, news is no longer what journalism was taught to me in school, which is you have to be fair and balanced and even have that third paragraph of the rebuttal statement, and then you make your conclusion afterwards. There's no rebuttal. All major news now seems to be editorial. Mm-hmm. To where you choose a side and you only present that side. I don't know if that's just me looking at where media is today, but it seems like that shift has gone to where now we can say whatever we want in whatever slant we want because it sells your brand of news.
Well, Roy, that's been happening. Very apt statement, and I say astute observation. This has been happening for the last couple of decades. And as we've gotten more and more deregulated in our media ownership, it has allowed more concentrated companies to own media. And as you mentioned, the slant, right? The slant is how these companies are able to guarantee a certain advertising revenue and income. They know that a certain demographic is going to watch this particular channel, the red channel, the blue channel, right? And people quickly start to figure out, even the people that are watching these channels, there's a percentage of them, of course, that don't want to hear disagreement. They don't want to, the other side's always wrong. But increasingly, more and more people in this country realize that they're not being given news, that they're being relentlessly propagandized. They're being agitated against things, and they're rarely being mobilized for anything that matters in their own community. The death of local journalism and the creation of news deserts has been a really challenging thing for us societally. And I think that the move away from ethical journalism in favor of the kind of gotcha or fear mongering that we see relentlessly, it just fills the airways, Roy, and it's unhealthy. And while it's, of course, important to be informed, kind of going back and riffing a little bit on some of the founders of this country, they would often say that it's sometimes we'd be better off if we had a country of newspapers and literate people than a government. And another spin on that is later on, sometimes folks are maybe better off being uninformed than misinformed or ill-informed. Yeah. And so turning off the corporate media or turning off the so-called mainstream news maybe turns down some of that noise, right? And part of what we write about in our work is how do you sift through that noise, and How do you sort of find factual reporting? And how do you not only process that, but how do you communicate effectively to other people and introduce them to a broader news media diet?
Yeah. So how do you do that?
Well, I think one of the things to remind people of first is to just slow down. I think right now there's so much pressure, especially in corporate media, that we all need to know everything and have an opinion on everything all the time. And we need to go to social media and share it. I completely disagree. Slow down. You can't know everything. You can't comment on everything. Try to focus on those handful of issues that you think are most important to you and your community.
Yeah.
Find the journalists who are reporting on them well. Interrogate those articles or podcasts or news broadcasts that are talking about that issue so you can become more knowledgeable of them. And I think, just echoing what Mickey said, cut out a lot of this corporate news media propaganda. It distracts people, it misleads people, it angers people, it exhausts people in a lot of respects. And so I think slowing down is really important. I think disabusing ourselves of the idea that we have to be loyal to a news outlet, like I'm a Fox viewer or WAPO reader. Every outlet has some good journalists. Find the good journalists and follow them, and maybe they'll leave that outlet for another, but follow the journalists. I wouldn't be so brand loyal to a lot of these outlets. I think they take advantage of readers in a lot of cases. Yeah. One of the ways we notice this is like in the op-ed pages. Historically, like opinion editorials were written because the editor of a paper thought that the audience was not getting an alternative view. So they would purposely bring in someone to give you a viewpoint they knew they weren't providing with their journalists. Yeah. That's completely changed in the last 20 years. Now editorials are just about preaching to the choir. They're making sure the subscribers know that their worldview is right and the other side is wrong, and they need to keep paying their subscriber fee to get news from the outlet.
And if the editorial is one that upsets them so much, they write in and say, I'm going to cancel my subscription if you keep publishing this horrible viewpoint. And so I think it's created, really we're feeding a beast rather than trying to inform the masses. What this really reminds me of, the day that we're living in now with what you just said, is when I was in high school, someone would come up with the greatest, juiciest rumor of the day. And there was always a group of people that, did you know? Did you hear? So-and-so did that one. Did you know? Did you know? And it feels like we're back in high school. And I mean, grown adults running with information before stopping and saying, but did you check with them before you're spreading this news about them? I really feel like it's so sophomoric today that we're in a realm of perpetual adolescence, it seems. Yeah. And it permeates our political culture, our news media culture, our entertainment culture. We live in a pervasive sort of commercial entertainment culture that's blurred the lines between news and entertainment and infotainment. And so much news that, the work we do at Project Censored talks about junk food news. So much information that comes across news outlets just has nothing to do with our daily lives. It gets us all worked up about the Kardashians, or who's Pete Davidson dating, or what's going on with some sports saga. And we really squander the time and resources we have to inform each other about. There's so many things going on, good and bad, Roy, around the country, around the world. And, Nolan and I both see in our classroom, based on exercises we do with students, we give them real life situations, circumstances, and problems to look at. And we give them a wide variety of different news sources to try to educate themselves about it. And they put together their own reports. They put together their own kind of perspectives about what's happening. And they're fully capable of doing what amounts to like a whole 10 or 15 minute news segment. And we're talking about undergraduates at community college here. Yeah. They'll put together a more factually accurate and more information packed segment in 10 or 15 minutes than you're going to get in hours on cable news. So it's not that we can't do it, and it's not that we're incapable. It's that this model we have for news, right, that's based so much on eyeballs and profits and sensationalism, it's hard to get any actual hard news wedged in to that kind of a structure. And again, it goes back to ownership and advertising and profits and reliance on elite sources and controlling of that narrative. And we think that having a grassroots community-based type of narrative where people are participants in the news that's happening, that it creates a more authentic
kind of voice, and it creates usable information that it fuels more meaningful civic engagement in our society.
I love that. My wife about a year ago was showing me a little YouTube video clip that someone put together that showed for a specific event and the messaging for it. It showed all of these news, and many of them were local news outlets, television outlets, and it was word for word the same. And she's like, see, I said, but hang on a second. There's this thing called Associated Press. And the Associated Press is used by a lot of these local news outlets, including newspapers, to have the content to fill their time or their pages. And so I said, yes, they're all saying the same, but even that video of trying to show common source reporting was slanting it to say, see, there's this big brother who is trying to get this message across. And so even within us trying to protect ourselves, we can get caught up in the sensationalism of someone showing that it's the exact same wording, but there are some things from the Associated Press.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes that stuff is necessary, but I do think ideally this goes back to the news desert problem, which is so many communities in this country do not have anybody covering their community. Ideally, like 24-hour news or national media was supposed to pick stories from the local media and then nationalize or globalize them. Instead, it's the reverse. We have this national media that often dictates stories down to local outlets. And getting back to what Mickey was saying, a lot of students, at least when they come into my class, they generally have an attitude that they don't like news or are bored with news. And when you engage with them, what they think news is, they think it's people shouting over each other on CNN, or they think it's, a sensational social media headline that has nothing to do with the story. But once you get them engaged with media news and information that's going on in their local community, now all of a sudden they're engaged. Now they care. Now they have an opinion. Now they want to look at the sources. And so I think it speaks to this natural human impulse. We want to know what's going on around us. We need to remember that news predates journalism. Humans have had spoken word and rumor and shared news forever. That's something endemic to the human experience. Yeah. And journalists are supposed to be a tool or a helper who's supposed to give us the news we can't access. And in so many communities today, we just don't have that.
Yeah. So what would you suggest? Because we've got people watching this podcast saying, there's so much conflict. There's so much going on. You have several systems. I love in one of your books, you outline the system that spells out the acronym CRITICAL. Walk us through that, because there's so much in that. It's so powerful in giving people a tool. Perhaps we can spend a little bit of time on that and help the people right here in the midst of this podcast to feel like, hey, finally someone's not just griping about the news, but someone's actually, and that's why I wanted you on. You guys have answers to, well, how do we address this in a positive way?
Yeah,
I can talk about Nolan. I was going to talk about the macro level, and I'll throw it over to Mickey, who can go through the letters. I think that'll be best. Cool. But yeah, the book's from Let's Agree to Disagree, and we broke it into 3 areas. So the beginning area was about how do we foster constructive dialogue? What does it look like? What does destructive dialogue look like? The second portion was about critical thinking and investigating media messages and power. And then the third part was about this media literacy component, about how do we interrogate different forms of media. Mm-hmm. And so we talked about these things broadly, the history of them and how to apply them. But then at the end of the text, we're solutions-driven people. So we wanted to create this toolkit that went through each of these suggestions, and they ended up spelling out the word critical, which I'll let Mickey explain that part from here.
Yeah, Nolan. When we talk about being critical, we aren't talking about being negative. We're not talking about tearing things down. And when we talk about interrogating sources, it means investigate. It means ask questions, be curious, right? As human beings, we're born inquisitive and curious. And, depending upon where we grow up or how, oftentimes, a lot of that kind of gets beaten out of us one way or the other, where we're funneled into certain paths. And, certainly some of that is like social norms and so forth. But at the root of being critical, it just means to be curious about why things happen the way that they do and not being afraid to ask questions. And asking questions isn't the same as asserting something. And so when we talk about being critical, we're talking about being more informed, better informed, a degree to which that you can then share that information with other people in meaningful ways and in meaningful, relevant contexts. So we think the word critical is actually a very positive word. Critical studies, critical media literacy, right? So with each letter, we have sort of an encapsulated concept that is discussed earlier on in the book. And the first letter, C, talks about creating constructive dialogue. You heard Nolan a moment ago just say, we actually reorganized the book when we were writing it, because when we were starting, we were like, we've got to start with the nuts and bolts of critical thinking, because we've really got to get people understanding what this means. It's not telling people what to think, it's helping people how to think more reasonably and logically. But then we hit the brakes and we said, hey, wait a minute. That's not going to matter so much if you're coming at somebody with your truth stick and you're, using it as a cudgel to bludgeon your enemies, right? Yeah. That's not dialogue. That's not constructive. And people likely aren't going to hear you. So we think creating constructive dialogue is really important. And we show it in the book. We model it in our classroom. The R is reflecting on communication practices. So the very first two things we're talking about here are, how do I sound out loud? And not just jumping in and correcting other people when we disagree, but this means being an active listener. It means being an empathetic listener. It means being sure you understand someone else's view or position and reasoning behind it before you say critical words about it, right? Meaning we don't want to just jump on people and, like, when they're talking, we're not just waiting for our turn. We're supposed to be processing it and absorbing it into our thought process, into what we're going to say next. Because the next thing then that comes out is then the letter I, inquire, be a critical thinker, right? That's part of that process. So Roy, I don't know if you want me, I can just jump through the rest of the list here and then we can jump off anywhere you want. T means testing theory and spotting ideology. It means be aware of the intellectual and cultural sort of constructs that frame and shape the way people are, what their values are, who they become, their belief systems. It's important that we understand what their values are, how values work, how and why they conflict. And what we start to discover is when we understand these things, Roy, is that we realize that often we do have shared values with those where we have disagreements. We just may not rank them the same way based on the same topic, based on this invisible implicit bias, the sort of who we are and how we were raised. But that's important to get to the bottom of, because it doesn't mean that someone is necessarily right or wrong in that regard. It's a tool for better understanding what makes somebody tick. Why are they concerned about that? And then you can go and get into more detail about it. And by the way, none of this means that we should be accepting abuse. We should not be abusive ourselves to others, and we shouldn't let other people abuse us or abuse others around us. Yeah. That means we shouldn't tolerate incitements to violence or things that debase our humanity. Those things end up debasing all of us. And that's also what we mean by this constructive dialogue. The letter I means we investigate and evaluate our media systems. We don't just take things at face value, right? A lot of our media, as you said, Roy, it's just a message that gets keeping repeated over and over again on one channel, and then a different message over and over again in reverse on another. That's not journalism, and so that's why it's important that we understand what ethical journalism is, which leads to the next C. Critique the content, understand fake news and propaganda, understand what ethical journalism means, what it looks like to have public interest journalism. It does exist. We highlighted the Project Censored all the time. There are many, including at these major news outlets that Nolan said, there are high quality journalists that work for some of these major outlets. It's just you don't get to see and hear from them all the time. A is we assess, analyze, and evaluate digital media as a new landscape and realize how often we are the products in the big tech sort of ecosystem. We're the ones being data harvested and manipulated and having our confirmation bias fed by social media algorithms, which often are very antisocial. And so we try to teach people how these tools work and how we can maybe use them to better the world rather than have them use us to tear each other apart. And of course, finally, L, we want to lead by example, Roy, because as you heard Nolan say earlier, democracy, living in a democratic republic is a 24/7 obligation. And it's a responsibility. Democracy is not a spectator sport. We have to engage in it, but it helps and it functions better when we all understand not only the rules of the game and can follow them, but we do so in a way that is intelligent, informed, compassionate, and seeks to find common ground and build bridges, not walls, as we are wont to say. And we think that if everyone did some modest amount of working toward this, we could vastly improve our communication systems. We could vastly improve our political culture and raise the level of our discourse. And I dare say we could have a better republic overall.
I love that. And I hope all of you watching this will look at the link down below here on our YouTube podcast here. We have the links for the books, Agree to Disagree, which has the critical acronym spelled out there for you, and the links to the other 3 books that you guys have written, because this is the stuff that we need. I think from 2020 on to actually 2019 all the way to 2023, when we're recording this in May of 2023, it gave us at least 3 great big punches. First of all, if you're not anti-racist, you're pro-racist was a message coming out, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, I don't like being polarized. I always tried to be a centrist myself, and I felt really uncomfortable when I was being told if I'm not anti-racist, I'm pro-racist, because there is a third way. And then, are you an anti-vaxxer or are you a pro-vaxxer? And I didn't like being put into that position because I didn't have the information. I don't know whether I should be for or against it. There's a reason why the pharmaceutical companies are getting these waivers that they cannot be sued, because they don't know what's going to happen to you years down the road from this vaccine. And now we're at this place. If you don't help a child go through the transgender process, well, you're killing them. I heard a person on a news outlet just this past week say that if we don't pay for this through government funding, that we're responsible for harm or doing them harm. And I was like, this is so polarizing. There is a third way. And, I taught, when I was teaching university for about 6 years, I taught comparative religion as one of the classes that I taught. And one of the interesting things, we have these sayings: turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. And we tend to think of it like what you were talking about there, Mickey, as, rolling over. We just got to take it, turn the other cheek. You just got to take it, go the extra mile. When you actually look at the culture of that time and the religions of that time, the Jewish culture at that time, turning the other cheek was not rolling over. It was a new revolution. It was a third way, and going the extra mile was not, a burden to you. It was truly a new revolution that this Jesus character was trying to promote in this way. Turn the other cheek. A Jew would never touch you with their left hand, because the left hand was the dirty hand that they used when they went to the bathroom. So they would only eat, they would only, touch people and anything that they didn't want to be unclean, they would touch with the right hand. And so if they struck you, it would always be with the right hand, whether a closed fist or open hand. It was always going to hit you right here on the left side. So turn the other cheek meant that if you're going to strike me, you've got to backhand me now. And backhanding a person now on this cheek, you would never backhand a subordinate. You would never hit them, with a backhand unless they were equal. It was part of their culture that you would never strike with an open fist someone who was your equal. And so this new revolution was saying, don't roll over, stand there and say, no, treat me as an equal. You have to strike me with the back of your hand to show that we are equal. To go the extra mile, the Roman soldier could require you, could conscript you. He sees you on the road and say, you have to walk with my gear for 1 mile. It's part of us being your imperial leaders. You got to do whatever we say. We've got our sandal on your neck. And so you, as the poor person, would have to carry their gear for a mile, and they have these mile markers on the road. But if you carried it the extra mile, that soldier could be punished so bad. And we actually have historical records showing soldiers who the commanding officer pulls out a tent, has this man beat almost to death, removes this guy's rank down to the lowest rank he can have because he caused someone to go beyond that mile marker with his gear. So who's in charge during the second mile where the soldier's like, give me my stuff. You got to give me my stuff. No, I have a few things I want to talk to you about. And as you're walking that extra mile, now who's in charge? How have roles reversed? Who's the one begging to stop now is the soldier. So it elevates your dignity in that moment. And so I think a lot of times we don't realize there is a third way in these discourses where it's all about what you said, Mickey. It's all about making sure to elevate the dignity of all people. And for me, that's where I'm always trying to find, where is this third path in this media crisis that we're having right now and societal angst, this third way of saying, no, how can we all elevate that we all have something to say and we can all be educated if we take this moment and actually allow all sides to be considered.
I think it's a great point. It's one of the things we point out in the text is that this idea of everybody being able to communicate and empowering everybody and raising voices. I mean, this was the promise of like 24-hour news media, and then it was the promise of social media. And what you find, I think, in those examples is we continuously are waiting for some corporate overlord or big tech inventor to solve our problems for us. And we point out in the text that that's not going to happen. It's going to take us all working collectively to solve a lot of these issues. And back to the examples you gave just a few moments ago about vaccines, for example, or trans identities and racism, you could really apply your critique to anything. I mean, you could apply it to the war in Ukraine, you could, Donald Trump, elections, etc. This gets back to what Mickey said earlier. There's just an immaturity or lack of sophistication when it comes to a lot of discussions in this country. We lack nuance. And I think once you see someone creating binaries, that's a great indication that's not someone who's a critical thinker. They're not, and just what you said a moment ago is something I always encourage people to do, demonstrate they're a critical thinker. If you're not sure if you should get a vaccine or not get a vaccine, just admit you're not sure.
Yeah,
that's fine. You don't have to be absolute opposed to it. Yeah, you don't have to be absolutely for it. Just admit, I don't know. I'm not a science, or I haven't read the papers, or I don't understand the paper, whatever it is. Yeah. And I think if we had more open dialogue like that, it would be constructive. But I think one of the cultural pressures we have now is there's this expectation to be ideologically pure and right all the time, because it can be like a weight around your neck for the rest of your life. If you get one thing wrong, they can bring it out for the next 10, 20, 30 years and ruin your life and your career. Right. That's no way to have a sophisticated democracy. We have to be able to take risks and make errors and make mistakes and still be treated like a part of the society.
Yeah.
And Roy, we need to have a discourse that not only allows disagreement, but allows people to be humbly wrong, allows people to see the benefit of change and adopting other views, or at least accepting other views, even if they're not your own. Right. And one of the things that struck me, Roy, when you were rattling down that list, was I was thinking about all the specifics of each of the kind of categories that you said, and like, what's the caricature of each side of the other, and how are they misportrayed in each other's own media silos? But the other thing that struck me, Roy, is we're also talking about value conflicts, right? And when you talk about anti-racism, pro-racism, and then just, well, I'm just not racist, there seems to be, that's not enough, as you said, right? So what I'm taking from the thread of what you had, and then pro-vax, anti-vax, rather than just one at a time, what's this one do versus that one? You brought in the idea of corporate immunity from 1986 that really factors into that, that shows that, big pharma isn't really an ethical operator in the realm of public health. And so we have reason to mistrust some of these kinds of companies for the things that they have done, including some good things, right? But it's not just all one way. It's not a binary, as Nolan said. We live in a land of we lack nuance, even though most of us swim in the gray area. And the last on identity. So what I'm getting at, my thread here, Roy, my big, maybe too long of a wind up for the pitch. You're talking about authoritarian type of construct. It's either this or that. There's no other way. You either kowtow to the mandate or you're against public health. You either kowtow to this ideology or you hate a certain kind of person. And look, in the real world, Roy, as you know, that's often not how interactions go. That's not how things are. But because we have this big media echo chamber and it's further platformed in our binary political parties, right, that don't represent most of us, let alone, like what they pretend to do.
Right.
It really confuses and it sets a bad example, in my opinion, by setting people up to fail in their day-to-day interactions, where instead of spending a moment getting to know somebody on the street that we may disagree with, we're quick to write them off and move on to the next.
Yeah.
Right. We don't. And Nolan said, slow down.
Yeah.
Right. Part of that slowing down isn't just with the information we get. It's slowing down with each other and offering things like grace to other people in ways that, we see each interaction as an opportunity, not just to tell somebody why they're wrong and I'm right, but what can we learn from each other in this interaction, and how can we use that interaction to make people who are victims of racism not only feel better and more empowered, but to feel safer in certain environments. Yeah. What about the My Body, My Choice crowd? On one hand, it applies, right, in feminist circles around abortion, but if you bring it up when it comes to bodily autonomy in other ways, suddenly it's no, this is about something different. And again, notice it's ships passing in the night. Two people talking about the same subject from very different angles, and they're never actually meeting on where the values are not aligned, but they're not working on then trying to align the values in a way that says, look, we don't totally disrespect each other's values. We have different applications for them in different specific areas for very specific reasons based on who we are, both as individuals and as groups or subgroups in society. So look, Roy, this is complicated stuff, really. And the part of slowing down is an invitation for us to give ourselves a little break, and also to give other people a break and allow communication and things to happen, and abandon the notion of instant gratification and everything needs to be solved right now. And let's work on building longer lasting relationships with the people around us in our institutions, so that we can try to elevate the lives of people across the spectrum, particularly those who do suffer social injustices. Those are important things that we should all try to address, even if we don't address them the same way.
Absolutely. I have felt like the approach to this, as you say, binary approach, it's this way or that way, has actually done more to undermine our opportunities to increase the dignity of all peoples. Because we're not talking about the actual issue of the person. We're talking about how bad this group is or how uninformed that group is, instead of dealing with the actual people and saying, how can we elevate your dignity? That's been one of the greatest frustrations to me.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we note, right? And I think you're speaking to this, that when you approach these conversations, part of your goal is to develop this reciprocity.
Mm-hmm.
So have respect and decency. And this gets back to what Mickey was saying earlier about nobody should ever have to sit there and take hateful speech from someone else. You should. This constructive dialogue only works when we have reciprocity. Well, that requires respect, dignity, integrity. You need to have things like that as part of the conversation, but you also need to have humility. Humans are contradictory. Mickey gave that example of the My Body, My Choice crowd, and how many people would hold that up as a principle. But then when it gets to issues of abortion or vaccine mandates, all of a sudden we see divergent perspectives on that very principle.
And then those people want us to see that, well, there's exceptions here.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, it's the human experience. We are contradictory. So that humility is really important to recognize. You're not ideologically pure. You're not perfect. You're not going to get everything right all the time. So open yourself up to the possibility that someone may have information or perspectives that will change your understanding of the world around you.
Yeah. Mickey, I know you have to leave the conversation because you have another obligation. Just wanted to give you a chance to give a few closing thoughts before you have to run.
Well, Roy, I want to thank you again for what you do and for inviting Nolan and I back, to be in conversation and dialogue with you. We had a remarkable time when we visited the studio, and we're on with you for the television program and look forward to that. But this is the exact kind of model that Nolan and I talk about, right? And we met long, long ago, as Nolan was a student in one of my classes, and have grown to be great friends and amazing colleagues. And it's been amazing to see how many great things that Nolan is doing to really try to make the world more navigable and a better place for more people. This is why education is so important. This is why we need to be careful to not censor differing ideas, and we need to foster differences of views and help people sort of learn how to do that in a way that, as you keep saying, Roy, like really raises the level of dignity. And I just appreciate being able to have a conversation with you about this and being able to speak with a lot of your viewers and listeners, many of whom I'm sure have very different ideas and positions that I may have on the things I do with Project Censored or other publications. But that's what it's about. It's about providing the opportunity to learn something and finding common ground so that when we do run into those conflicts, and we will, because they're an inevitable part of life, maybe we can do it in a way that reminds us that there's more to learn, more to do, and it's a lifelong journey. And I'm just honored to be on it, and again, honored to be on with you to have this conversation. So thanks so much for the invitation, Roy. Greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and I'm sure we're going to have you back on again, because I imagine we're going to get a lot of positive feedback from this conversation and people wanting to know more. How do we truly expand ourselves into the best version of ourselves, so that we can then communicate with the world that really needs to have the conversations that we need to have. So thank you so much. I'm going to continue the conversation here with Dr. Higdon. Nolan,
you're in good hands. Thanks, Roy.
Exactly.
Thanks,
All right. Hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely.
This is the coolest part of the story. Dr. Huff, Mickey, was your professor. When you first came in to his class and you started hearing his approach and his philosophy, what was your immediate reaction?
Well, it's a really interesting story, because it took place in 2002, 2003, right up to the invasion of Iraq by the United States, the second invasion of Iraq, by the second Bush, for people who are confused. But it was right at that time period. And I had never been a serious student, never took high school that seriously, was sort of just, I guess, taking college courses to kind of find myself. But, now in hindsight, we knew there was this large scale propaganda campaign to convince the US to invade Iraq. There were these lies about weapons of mass destruction and Saddam's connection to 9/11 that were told. And if you spoke out against those lies, we have to remember that time period. It was chilling. You were treated as a nutcase and, some crazy conspiracist and just thrown out. But Mickey, really in his class took the details of what was being said in news media and broke them down piece by piece to say, here's what does have evidence. Here's what doesn't have evidence. Here's historical context for how many times government has lied us into war in the past. And, sitting there in class, I couldn't even comprehend what I was hearing. But it planted an important seed, because outside of the classroom, I'm watching, 3/4 of Americans say things like America, love it or leave it, or horrible things about Muslims in the Middle East or in Iraqis. And it was totally acceptable at that time. I know we hide it in America now, but 20 years ago, you could easily get away with that in public discourse.
Absolutely.
Much to my surprise, after 2 years of me getting called a conspiracy theorist for saying there were no weapons of mass destruction, the Defense Department admitted there were no weapons of mass destruction. The Defense Department's not exactly like liberal hippies. No. And then of course independent investigations and the UN and by just last year I was watching, might have been this year or last year, I was watching Jeopardy, and one of the clues on Jeopardy admitted there were no weapons of mass destruction. So that was a really important episode in my life, a classroom, where they were saying what was true and accurate, even though the majority, overwhelming majority of the rest of the country was saying and believing the opposite. Yeah. It taught me the power of education. It made me curious about news media. It made me take schooling more seriously. And I think, those are the outcomes now I know as being an educator that you want to see in your classroom. That's what you want to see your students do.
Absolutely. I think one of my greatest frustrations when I was teaching on a university campus about a decade and a half ago, I taught for 6 years. We used to have a joke in my office amongst my staff that we needed to have one of those red deli ticket dispensers and the sign, now serving guest number 427, because I constantly had a line of students at my office who were torn down, broken down by the academia teacher, and just didn't know how to piece things together, was not given the tools to put things back together. And one of these years, a professor who was the cause of a lot of my appointments in the office won the Teacher of the Year award. And her award speech, during her speech, she says, "I just love the opportunity to take these young students into my classroom who have all these ideals and all these thoughts, and to just tear them all down." And that's where she left it. And so I'm frustrated, because here I'm trying to coach these young people who say, now I have no basis for my ethics. I have no basis for my morals. There is no religious text that I can use as authoritative. I can't use this or that. And they had nothing to base who they would be as a character, because the higher echelons of academia were telling them, and this is in the honors classes, this is like the brightest of the bright students at the university I was working at, were just completely torn down. And so imagine when we have faculty pre-week, we're all faculty, together, and they put us in a breakout session. And of course, I'm with 4 of these teachers at a table that they just pride themselves in tearing down. You can't believe in this, and there's no belief in that. And here I am, of course, stuck at this table, and the professor repeats her thing. Well, I just take great delight in tearing down these students. And people that know me know that I would probably just sit there and just grin and bear it, whatever. But it was my last nerve. My last nerve. And I slapped the table and I said, "Where's the genius in that? Any monkey can tear apart an engine. Build me the ultimate driving machine. Then I'll call you a genius." And it was crickets. It was totally quiet, and it was very inappropriate what I did, and I admit it. But I was so angry, because here these poor students were being taught by these teachers who, in some way, it gives them this sense of, look at my control, look at my power over these students that can't argue against me and win, because I've got more bullets than they do. I'm more informed than they are. And because of that scenario, I had students who literally their ethics, their morals, their religion, spirituality, they just threw out the door, because obviously I can't believe any of those things anymore. And so I'm extremely passionate about what you're doing to say, no. Let me help you build a better engine. What are some of the ways that, in some of the experiences that you're having with your students, as far as you're seeing them say, I don't know what's authoritative or not, because you talk about these different news sources, but how are you helping them to understand what they really can hang their hat on and say, this is authoritative and this is not?
Yeah, one of the things I think this speaks to your experience that you were talking about. I've always had solutions in the classroom, so I tear down any institution of power in my class, as I think we should in the classroom. But we should also introduce students to possible other scenarios that are out there.
Yeah.
And when I say introduce, I don't mean tell the students this is what we need to do, like be a part of my political project, join the revolution. What are the different solutions that are being proposed, even if they're contradictory, one from the right, one from the left, one from secular, one from religious, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Give them those possibilities so they can possibly engage with them and implement their own solution. When it comes to their media use, I do a lot of work with digital media use recently. So I remind them that when they come to my class, I'm not the protectionist guy. I'm not going to tell you that all media is bad, you need to put it away. I say, look, we all get joy from media. Sometimes we just do it for pleasure, and that's fine. Like, I watch pro wrestling. There's nothing scholarly about it. It does nothing for my job. I just enjoy it. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Can't defend it, but it is what it is. So I tell them, the key is to be a knowing participant in media. You negotiate your relationship with media.
Yeah.
So one of the things I tell them is to, take out an old school piece of paper and write pros and cons of using social media. And then when it's sitting there in front of you, make a determination. Is it worth it for you? Maybe it is for you. Maybe it's not for me. Maybe it is for this student, not that student, whatever.
Yeah.
I always tell them about the permissions on their phones.
Yeah.
Right now, the permissions are all on. It's too easy to be using your digital devices all the time.
Yeah.
So the way that the dynamics are set up are in favor of the digital device. Turn off all those permissions. See if you want to turn them back on to use the device. You'll find that you don't as much, and so you'll use it less. Now you have the power to over that relationship. And so I think teaching these types of tools are very helpful. And your question about students returning, one of the things I never anticipated, but I hear this all the time from former students is, oh gosh, after I took your class, I ended up getting rid of all my social media accounts. And I never tell them to do this, but they just said like, yeah, after, examining it. And I just thought, this isn't working for me. There's other things I want to do. There's other, other things give me happiness, or other things give me pleasure that I just wasn't getting from, Facebook or whatever it may be. And so I think I've seen that the power of that. Anybody who's taught knows the worst thing you can do is tell students what to do. They'll inevitably
and tell them what not to do.
Yeah.
And now it's super exciting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think just, planting those seeds to give them the power to make determinations about their own life. They're humans. They want all the things that humans have wanted previously.
Yeah.
They'll do it in the right direction. They just need perspective.
Yeah, I love that. In the digital space, this is where I found a lot of individuals now in the social media digital space see themselves in the same light that we used to view journalists. A journalist puts their claim out there, their evidence of what's happening. And to me, everyone's a journalist. I think it's interesting that Google, their new AI, Google Bard, doesn't use Google Internet when it's trying to write things and come up with what is the answer to your question or write a brief on some topic. They actually uploaded, from what I understand, they uploaded books. And it only is scanning what was the uploaded information, because books have to be vetted. You have at least one layer of, it had to go through peer review, if it's scientific or if it's anything with data driven, whatever. And so I think it's really interesting that even Google Bard, the new AI, doesn't say, well, what does the internet say? What does Google say? Because you get such extreme variance in what is truth.
Yeah, and I think a model like that may work out. I am worried, I'll admit, in the long term about what Google is doing, because at least traditionally, everybody knows you go to Google to find resources, you click through the resources to find the answer or the resource you're looking for. They seem to be taking that step out, and now they're going to just directly give you the information. And I wonder how this is going to hurt researchers and journalists in the future, because you're not going to go to, name your news outlets, the New York Times or whatever, and go find your news article. You can type into Google what's going on in Ukraine, and it'll give you a response without ever giving the click to those journalistic outlets. So how are a lot of these outlets going to survive?
Yeah.
And I wonder the same thing with researchers. If people get to a point where they feel like, how do I do constructive dialogue? I'll just ask Google versus go buy a copy of Let's Agree to Disagree. Yeah. What's going to happen to the, 10, 20 years from now, the future of journalists? So I get the idea of what they're proposing, but I'm always hesitant to have much faith in Google.
Well, or any of these information conglomerates. I found a couple of things. This is before AI came out. I would have a couple of other individuals do the exact same search that I did, and they would come up with different hits. Mm-hmm. Than I did. And it's based on the algorithm of what they think I'm looking for. So if in a young person's search for what is truth, based on the algorithm that Google has assigned to you and your user account, you will see a very much a slant toward what you've been looking for, versus basically this is everything and these are the top hits, regardless of who you are. And so there's that. But secondly, with Google Bard, I haven't tried all the Chat GPT and stuff like that, but I received an invitation to try it. So I tried Google Bard. And what I realized, there's a lot of fear in, especially as a professor, your kids, are they going to write their own papers or what? There's a formula, because I punched in several different suggestions of write this and write that. There is such a formula that, as a former professor myself, I could spot it without running it through any computer program. Yeah, this was written by AI. But the other thing that I noticed is that, for example, like if I ask the information that you have and agree or agree to disagree, your book, AI still is not at the place to truly tell the story like a human author needs to tell the story. We don't have any fear of them writing novels and stuff yet, because it's just it's very bland how it comes out. And so, for example, for your book, all the subtle nuances and how you build up to your points, it just doesn't seem to be in the AI algorithm yet.
Yeah, I'm a big AI skeptic.
Yeah.
I'm feeling more and more lonely each day, but I'm an AI skeptic for the reasons you just described. Like a lot of the like computer engineer writers, like Meredith Broussard wrote a book called Artificial Unintelligence, and I think it's Gary Anderson wrote AI Delusion. And in both books, they said that, you know, engineers abandoned the idea of this sentient AI like decades ago. It's always going to be, the human fingerprints are going to be all over whatever AI is producing. I think what you're describing there speaks to that.
Yeah.
It's not it's an engineer. It's not a writer who's producing a lot of this content. And they've done a lot of tests to illustrate how the human bias is in AI. So one person asked ChatGPT which countries' people are deserving of torture, and it named 7 adversaries of the U.S. You know, which is clearly a U.S. bias, right?
Obviously.
Yeah. So those kinds of biases exist, but this is why I say I'm so afraid of what companies like Google are doing, is because a lot of people, I think, have been convinced that this is some objective, all-knowing, powerful AI that's telling them what content to see or what news is true, but it has its own bias, and it also, more importantly, has its own conflicts of interest. I know this from teaching news media. You asked me a moment ago about how you give students different sources. I purposely give students sources that are inaccurate or misleading.
Yeah.
Now or alternative sources, and I really have to go out of my way to different search engines to find them, because Google News only gives corporate news sources.
Really?
That's something that changed in its algorithm in 2018, 2019.
Huh.
And so unless you know the alternative news outlet and type it in, it won't bring it up. And this has really crippled a lot of non-corporate news outlets. But that's a decision. I mean, I've made a career out of pointing out the inaccuracies in corporate news media. So it's not like corporate news media is more accurate.
Yeah.
You know, Google's made a decision that they trust these more. And so now people are only fed information from these limited sources. And I'm worried about how they're using AI and things like that to manipulate users.
Yeah, we don't even need AI to manipulate users
already.
I think of the manipulation that just in the past year or so that I've seen on social media. For example, Joe Biden proposes, hey, let's pay for student loans. And of course, there's an outcry on one side. That the one that I thought was quite manipulative were the people that said, what would Jesus do? Wouldn't Jesus want to forgive their debts? And I laughed, but I had people literally quoting that to me, that I'm happy. You know, at first I wasn't for it, but now I'm happy because I had to ask the question, would Jesus do that? And I said, hang on a second. You realize the argument is not whether Jesus would forgive student loans or not. The argument is Joe Biden doing it for the same reasons that Jesus would do it? No, stop comparing Joe Biden to Jesus. He's not Jesus by a stretch. And so this manipulation of, I want to give you an unarguable stance. You can't argue against it, or you're arguing against Jesus, and you can't argue against Jesus. And so from that standpoint, I feel like a lot of social media points of view try to make sure they have an unarguable stance. So if you're against it, well, you're against Jesus then.
Yeah, the study came out last year that confirmed that what we already know, but essentially that it's not necessarily that the people on social media are liars, or that they or disproportionately use like appeals to emotion. It's the way that these platforms are built. They privilege and value lies and appeals to emotion more. So if you perpetuate a lie, especially an absurd lie that gets appeals to someone's lower human emotions of hate and fear, more people are going to engage with it online, which means that the algorithm is going to amplify that content.
Really?
So when we're in the online space, we're not all equal in terms of if you post some, I post something. How much engagement the posts get dictates how many people will end up seeing it. And engagement usually is a result of the way the algorithm's built with hate, fear. Social media tries to get you to react.
People to comment and react as much as possible. I found that we were doing during COVID, the lockdown, we were doing some live YouTube videos. And because I already had a preset audience of people coming in, and my tech guy is really brilliant. He says, I know how to get us on the suggested live page. When you go to the homepage of YouTube and it's like, hey, maybe you want to watch these things. He goes, watch this. And so he just put out a question. Where are you watching from? How are you doing? Just something simple that everyone would be like, oh, I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska. Hey, I'm from Los Angeles, whatever. And because he did that, we started looking at how many impressions, how many people saw on their suggested video page on YouTube. And it spiked up from like before we did it was like maybe 35,000. And then it jumps up to 250,000. And then it jumps up to 750,000 just by us getting the people to comment on the live video as we're doing it. I mean, and that was all free advertisement we got just simply because we had that immediate engagement within the first 2 minutes of the video being live.
Yeah. And that's how value is determined in the digital space right now, is basically these likes, impressions. So savvy content creators, no, you have to appeal to the audience in some way to get them to engage. And sometimes a lot of people, oftentimes, leads to nefarious behavior.
Yeah.
We're getting them to engage by making a comparison between Jesus and Joe Biden, right?
Yeah.
Because that will please some people and outrage others. And so you'll end up getting engagement on the platform.
Yeah. Well, as you look at everything that you're currently doing now, what's the most exciting thing to you where you're seeing some movement based on your work and Dr. Huff's work? What's some things that are exciting you right now?
Yeah, I think there's two trends I've noticed that please me very much. One is we're starting to see the fragmentation of social media, which I predicted at conferences like 8 or so years ago would happen, which is, when we had Friendster and MySpace and even Facebook and Twitter, the majority of social media users were all on those same platforms and you were getting content from all those same people. But as time has gone on, we've separated by age, we've separated by ideology. Yeah. And now we're starting to get to a point where people don't trust these platforms because they realize they're being surveilled, which I'm also happy about, which our work has spoken to. And so you see people using things like Discord or Substack. And you see a lot of Silicon Valley and big tech freaking out because they're losing revenue. And we see this in, unfortunately, the people who are laid off from their jobs there. Mm-hmm. And we see it with tweaks made by like Elon Musk. You can buy a blue check or you can pay to amplify your tweets. So I think we're seeing social media in a crisis, but I say that in a positive sense. I think social media could have been anything, but the way we unrolled it in the early 2000s was a disaster. And so I'm glad to see that. I'm also pleased to see now a lot more media discourse on talking to the other side. I don't think they're doing it. I'm not confident that the economic incentives are there, but at least it's an issue for debate. I've seen, commentators like Bill Maher talk about it. I've seen podcasters like Joe Rogan talk about it. I've even seen people on like CNN talk about it. And so I'm hoping in the next couple of years, people start to realize that we can't continue to have a democracy and hate each other. We're going to have to learn to live with one another. Yeah. And so I'm hoping that's where those conversations go.
I love that. In my role as a celebrity life coach, working with people who are just trying to figure out how do I succeed in all areas of life, including just your own sense of peace and joy. It all starts with this question: what do you really, really want? And I would guess that most people want peace and they want to rid themselves of this. It's almost hate speech that has gotten people to be so polarized today. I think what people really, really want today is to go back to a sense of peace, a sense of dignity, uplifting each other, more of a loving discourse. And if that's what we really, really want, we have to go to question number 2 out of 5, which is, well, what's the obstacle that's standing between you and what you want? And ultimately, you outlined in this conversation, both in print and in broadcast media and in social media, the digital landscape, that there are things that we can do to either go around or overcome the obstacle that's keeping us from this peace, love, the discourse that we really want to have, if we look at it that way. Any final words that you'd like to say?
I think I'll just echo something I tell my students all the time. There's so much pressure on us, especially at a young age, to do good in school so you can go get the good job. I always tell my students, yes, you're going to need to eat and you're going to need a roof over your head. So I'm not going to say that you can survive in a capitalist economy without a job. But you also want happiness. So what is happiness to you? What is it? Is it, rolling around the ground with your dogs? Is it finding a romantic partner? Is it, doing some great hike and pushing yourself, whatever it may be?
Yeah.
I think we also need to talk about valuing those goals a lot more in our society. And I'd encourage listeners to really reflect on that.
Yeah.
What is it that makes you happy?
And I would just add one thing to it. And it's the one thing that most people miss is there's a thing called happiness, which comes from all the exteriors, the dog, the relationship, the house, the nice community, the job, whatever. Those are external factors. But the thing that will bring you joy and peace is when you connect with not your life's occupation, but your life's vocation. Your life's vocation is to say, what can I do to help other people be happy? What can I do to help other people find joy and peace and contentment? That's your life purpose, is to help other people really have a better life because of your presence. That's what you're doing. That's what Dr. Huff is doing, and trying to help people understand there's a better way where you can be happier. And this is part of your purpose that you're living out, is saying, I need to help people. And it brings you inner joy that externals couldn't bring either.
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to that, the community building. Communities have been ravaged for a multitude of reasons. We don't want to get into it too, but I think rebuilding that community necessitates loving others and helping others and wanting others to succeed. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's our ultimate goal. Thank you so much for being with us on this podcast episode. Don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button so you can find more content like this. Also, don't forget to go to our website. We've got a ton of resources to help you live your best life possible. That website is lifestyle.org. You can watch our broadcast show, Lifestyle. You can also read a ton of articles on how you can live your best life in the 5 key areas of life. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.